We're good. Okay, so welcome to this penultimate, which is, of course, a highfalutin way of saying third from the last session of the spring 2026 workshops. Now I can be heard. So welcome, those of you here and abroad. So I'm Jerry Singerman, who, along with Zachary Lesser, who has disappeared, but will be back in a minute. Zach is walking in right now. Zachary Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and walking through the door right now. And John Pollock, the Curator of Research Services in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, is also at Penn. So the three of us are the current co-conveners of these workshops, which have been taking place, as we never tire of repeating, with extraordinary regularity on Monday afternoons during the academic year, ever since their founding by Peter Stallybrass in 1993. We're made to look much more efficient in this capacity than we would ever be on our own by Priya Namrath, doctoral candidate in South Asian Studies at Penn and the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. Priya has just now started a sign-up sheet circulating around the table, which is really the least of her duties, but we ask those of you who are in the room to please write in your name and affiliation so that we have a record of attendance, which we like to give to the dean as the dean asks for such things when funding comes due. We also encourage you to add your email address as well if you're not already on the listserv and would like to be. And then Priya will send you our regularly weekly announcements. Now, more challengingly, Priya is also handling all aspects of the remote feed of the seminar. We ask those of you who are joining us remotely to let her know through the chat if you're having any problems with the video or audio. And if you too are not already on our listserv and would like to be, please let her know so that she can add your name to the mailing lists. Priya will also be curating the chat during the Q&A, and you're welcome to post your questions or comments there so that she can communicate them to the room. Better yet, though, please think about turning on your cameras, unmuting yourselves, and using the raise hand function so that we can see, hear, and call upon you directly. It's my great pleasure now to introduce James M. Brophy. Jim took his undergraduate degree from Vassar College, did his graduate work at the Eberhard Kaus Universität in Tübingen and Indiana University, Bloomington, from which institution he received his master's and PhD degrees. Since 1992, he's been on the faculty of the University of Delaware, where since 2012, he's been the Francis H. Squire Professor of History. His teaching and research focus on the social and political history of 19th century Germany and Central Europe, and his scholarship has been supported by the DAAD, the NEH, the APS, and the Max Kade Foundation, among others. He's been a fellow of the Center of Advanced Studies at the Ludwig-Maximilian Universität in Munich and of the Center for Book Studies at that same institution, of the Institute of Advanced Studies at the Central European University in Budapest, and of the American Academy in Berlin. He's editor of Perspectives from the Past, Primary Sources in Western Civilization, which was published by Norton in 2020, and he co-edited with Gabriela Clemens and Bärbel Holz Vormetzliche Belege zwischen Zensurbuchmarkt und Lesepublikum, published by Thorbecke in 2023. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, he's the author of three monographs: Capitalism, Politics, and Railroads in Prussia, 1830 to 1870, which was published by the Ohio State University Press in 1998, Popular Culture and the Public Sphere in the Rhineland, 1800 to 1850, published by Cambridge in 2007, and most recently, Printmakers and Print Markets and Political Dissent, Publishers in Central Europe, 1800 to 1870, published by Oxford in 2024. In this last book, he examines how authors and publishers navigated the perilous waters of political communication in the late absolutist states of Prussia and Austria in the period between Napoleon through 1848 and up to the unification of the German state. Lifting from the OUP description of the book, I quote, "As the narrow perimeters of political communication curtailed the open market of ideas, the publishing industry contested this information order, working both within and outside legal parameters. Their expansion of print markets, their cat and mouse game with censors, and their ingenuity in packaging political commentary sheds light on the production and reception of dissent. Against the backdrop of censorship and police surveillance, the successes and failures of these citizens of print tell us much about 19th century civil society and Central Europe's tortuous pathway to political modernization. Brophy's book was shortlisted for the 2025 Book History Prize of SHARP, an association many of us know, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publication, and has been recognized as a Book of the Year by History Today. It's won both the Hans Rosenberg Prize of the Central European History Society for the best monograph by a North American-based scholar, and the David Barclay Prize of the German Studies Association for the best monograph in English or German on the social, cultural, or labor history of 19th or 20th century Germany or Central Europe, so a rather broad field. It's a study with obvious and enriching resonances with path-breaking work with which many of us are more familiar, I dare say, on the intersections of print culture and politics in the 18th century French context. And I cue here for one Roger Chartier, who will be speaking to this group 2 weeks from today on April 27th. We look forward as ever to Roger's presentation at the end of the term, even as we eagerly seize the moment and the more immediate opportunity to listen to and learn from Jim Brophy, speaking this very evening on Printing Political Dissent, German Publishers in the Age of Revolutions. So welcome.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you, Jerry, for this very, very generous introduction. And while I'm handing out thanks to Penn faculty, let me also thank Professor Vance Bird, who is in Berlin, but it was he, I think, who connected us and got things rolling. So thank you very much, Vance. And just let me say that it's just a pleasure to be here speaking at this seminar. I've visited this seminar 3 or 4 times, and it's something of a storied seminar. Its reputation is known on both sides of the Atlantic, so it's wonderful to be here. I wrote this book on using book history methods because I felt that social and political historians haven't tapped fully into the richness and of book history, and this was another way to think about the granularity of the public sphere. But in so many ways, I stand on the shoulders of seminars like this and book historians and scholars of reading and publishing. So in many ways, this is an argument for the unanointed into book history more than what I would make perhaps give to experts in this room. But in any case, thank you so much. So fantastic. Can I see the slides here, or do I have to look at my mug? Horrible, right? Looking here. So I can just minimize that. Thank you so much. Terrific. In view of this seminar's title, let's begin with a material text, a folk calendar from the 1840s. The short-lived The Wanderer on the Rhine, published in Mannheim between 1839 and 1847. Let's see if this works. Beautiful. The calendar almanac was one among hundreds in Germany. As you know, they were staples in all households for their record of time and their information on market days, festivals, lunar cycles, and much more. They were also cash cows for printers. Beginning in the 1790s, and especially after 1815, publishers larded in political information and commentary into these publications. But the outright democratic boosterism of this particular calendar stands out. Its issues contain portraits of radical Democrats, essays on republicanism, and catechistic dialogues that demanded the political participation of farmers and laborers. When placed within the strictures of the era censorship, this calendar is remarkable for its subversive content, which transferred high and middlebrow commentary across genres, formats, and modalities of knowledge. Its abbreviated texts, its compact format, and its political direction poses a series of questions about reception, reading practices, and the construction of popular political subjectivity. But it also raises another question. Who was this publisher who transformed a common household item into a primer for democratic civil society? Indeed, the publisher, Heinrich Hoff, was one among dozens of printer booksellers who repackaged critical commentary for new readerships. In fact, Hoff's commitment to republicanism would cost him his livelihood during the 1848 revolution, when the liberal government imprisoned him for his democratic newspaper and drove his thriving press into bankruptcy. This is a liberal. He died penniless in New York City in 1852. Hoff is best known for publishing leading figures of German radicalism, Ludwig Feuerbach, Gustav Struve, Friedrich Hecker, but he also peddled pamphlets, fly sheet, and tavern gazettes that tell us much about how publishers broadcast political dissent. Their market strategies, which rewired print circuits, provides a window onto political communication that moves beyond the abstraction of the so-called public sphere. How did Hoff and others reconcile print markets with political ideals? Let me turn to Otto Wiegand, one of Leipzig's most prominent publishers of the mid-19th century, to define the dilemma of the printer bookseller. In 1839, he wrote, "The book dealer has a double-sided character. He is a merchant and must therefore know his wares. But he is more than a businessman. Because his relationship to the nation's most noble products assign him a higher role, he is the mediator between the intellectual aristocracy and the people. The talent that he attracts with his right hand, he must give with his left to the reading rabble. This twofold relationship with society's outermost strata constitutes the difficulty of this task and duty." Wiegand's statement frames today's principal themes. He points to the onset of a mass book market. By characterizing customers as a reading rabble and as part of society's outermost strata, he acknowledges the growing segmentation of print markets, which had moved beyond established readerships of the late Enlightenment. Wiegand's self-image as a cultural broker also commands our attention. By uniting the nation's most noble products with the common reader, Wiegand casts publishers as cultural emissaries with the duty of mediating culture to an ever-widening reading public. No less important, his reference to the difficulty of this task invokes the subtext of politics. Wiegand's generation inherited the cultural patrimony of early modern publishers who tirelessly promoted the freedom of expression and for this reason routinely traded clandestine literature. Their use of false imprints and other tricks to move forbidden literature only grew over the 18th century, endowing 19th century publishers with the confidence to carry out established practices of smuggling in the name of open inquiry. Otto Wiegand himself embraced this ethos. He contested censorship for decades, from the 1820s in Pest through the 1860s in Leipzig. He was the principal publisher of left-wing Hegelians. He tirelessly advocated Polish, Hungarian, and German liberalism. His underground pamphlet trade in the Habsburg territories was so great that Metternich placed a complete embargo on his press in 1846. On other fronts, he translated the French Enlightenment for popular markets in the 1830s, and as a Leipzig burgher, he denounced Saxony censorship in his municipal offices. His many arrests and court appearances, I count 36, and his time in jail, about 8, denote genuine conviction. As with other book dealers, he used profits from novels, lexica, and periodicals to offset potential losses with political commentary. Wiegand's finesse and daring form one part of a larger story as to how publishers, print markets, and readerships collectively broaden opinion formation, lay the groundwork for participatory politics, and transform political culture in Central Europe. And there you have the Engel's famous cartoon sketch of Die Freien in Berlin, and people always talk about Ruge, and they're always pointing out Max Stirner, but our man Otto is back with that red arrow there. He's also with the revelers. He was a radical Democrat, but not a socialist, and yet he still published socialism. Just sort of a commitment to open inquiry. How does a social history of publishing illuminate the processes of communication, which enabled civil society to express dissent against the established interests of state, church, monarchy, and aristocracy? We know much about the authors who challenged the political establishment, but historians overlook the mechanics of book markets to grasp how production and distribution affected the reception of political dissent. A newer scholarship on censorship has illuminated the workarounds of this regulatory process and the vigilant reading cultures that it spawned. But the tendency to emphasize authorial victories against censorship hides broader structural problems of producing and distributing print matters. And my reference to vigilant reading cultures, I'm referring to Carlos Spurhase and his circle of literary and scholars and historians who are doing really fine work on reading practice for merits. Similarly, the mellifluous language of transnational communication regarding flows and transfers fails to convey the stoppages, the interruptions, the suspensions, confiscations, and not least the fines and prison sentences that attend print exchange. The station-to-station struggle of schlepping print matter goes missing, and it is these granular details that double as a critical political tale. If this emphasis on publishers seems overdone, after all, it's authors who create the words, and it is readers who complete their meaning, let's remember that publishers were the risk takers who brought print matter to market. They financed the cost of printing, warehousing, and distributing books. They bore financial loss and legal responsibility. Without their capital and initiative, without their commercial connections and bonds of trust with other book dealers, and without their savoir-faire in overcoming economic, geographical, and political obstacles, the cultural institution of political dissent is hard to imagine. Their willingness to speculate on varying modes of political expression, to receive and sell contraband, political contraband of their colleagues, and to serve as local depots for dangerous literature is essential for explaining how oppositional politics unfolded in the first half of the 19th century in Central Europe. Today's talk highlights publishers as political actors by first looking at how their commercial practices promoted a more open public sphere. Second, how their print markets widened the spectrum of political dissent. Third, how they negotiated censorship regimes. And finally, how we should assess both their achievements and limitations in the period between Napoleon and the Unification era. Drawing on 300 publishers dispersed over German-speaking lands, this study uses the methods of book history to write a social history of political dissent. Because the book trade was first and foremost about turning a profit, let's begin with the business of print. Because early modern cameralism promoted domestic industry in Germany's many small and mid-sized states, German publishing didn't follow the general path of concentration found in England and France. Instead, the Holy Roman Empire and the German Confederation dispersed printing operations over dozens of cities. Moreover, German booksellers combined production with retail longer into the 19th century than their French and English counterparts. This hybrid operation, known as a print bookstore or a Verlagsbuchhandlung, combined presses, a bookshop, and offices that oversaw the acquisition, production, and distribution of books. In 1805, 339 print bookstores plied their trade in 137 cities. In 1846, 970 shops in 294 cities widened this hinterland. My study examines 391 cities. This polycentric diffusion had enormous political significance. It was also very hard to research because too many libraries, too many archives. Because bookstores were also print shops, these smaller operations not only contributed to national and international print circuits, but also produced pamphlets, fly sheets, and gazettes for local sale at very small print runs. This grassroots stratum of the public spheres remains woefully under-researched, but offers important clues about the linkage of dissent at the local, regional, and national levels. Because of this decentralized production, printer booksellers use the semi-annual book fairs of Frankfurt and Leipzig to exchange their wares and settle accounts. Because of multiple currencies and complex exchange rates, publishers exchanged mostly in kind until 1760, when the Leipzig Book Fair dramatically established cash exchange, so-called Nettohandel, which set in motion a new era of speculation, competition, and expansion in print wares, which scholars have labeled the Second Print Revolution, reaching its apex in the 1840s with over 13,000 new titles per annum. And this is a classic graph that you see in many books. And this is just an instructional heuristic because this is in many ways wrong. This is just books at the Leipzig Book Fair. There's a whole other element to book trade, sometimes called the Reichsbuchhandel, the imperial book trade, mostly in Catholic, Southwestern, and Western territories that didn't deal with this Northern and Protestant entrepreneur situation whatsoever. We also have to keep in mind the unauthorized publishing of books in Austria. And in that sense, this number shows you the dramatic increase of titles, but in fact, it's much more, is what I would argue here. Positive and negative features attended this boom. If rising literacy and a shift to ephemeral literature triggered a so-called reading mania for novels, literary digests, magazines, and political journalism, on the negative side, confessional divides, distance to markets, copyright piracy, and most of all, intensified censorship all undermined the broader circulation of open inquiry. The antagonism that inhered between political authority and print markets frames the book's argument. Because the revival of corporatist absolutism after 1815 deprived most Germans and Austrians of the right to participate in public affairs, print matter that invited political reflection and criticism was inimical to state interests. Officials worried about constitutional reform and the tenets of republicanism and popular sovereignty, and for good reason, for such discourses had circulated in Central Europe for decades. Put in other words, the information order of the late absolutist state clashed with the inherent dynamics of print markets. The absolutist state policed ideas and knowledge according to its needs, and in good cameralist fashion set norms for communication. Austria, Prussia, and other polities thus established a privileged hierarchy of regulation for those who had access to all, some, or no information. By contrast, publishers strove to widen the conduits of communication. Responding to consumer demand for news and commentary, print culture promoted independent opinion and thereby clashed with the information order of the late absolutist state, whose regulatory policies curtailed saleable ideas. Herein lay the central tension. Because Austria and Prussia remained unconstitutional states that discouraged, hindered, and prohibited deliberation among numerous social groups, political print matter threatened the legitimacy of late absolutist rule. Significantly, publishers pushed back against state directives in both legal and illegal ways to market political dissent. Who were these publishers, and what were their motives? The heterogeneity of this profession resists simple generalization, but most combine the attributes of the commercial and the professional classes, that is, the Wirtschafts- und Bildungsbürgertum. They owned their shops and hired and fired as they saw fit. As capitalists, they prized their entrepreneurial independence and their commercial rights. Most were town burghers of middling means, although such moguls as Johann Friedrich Kotte or Friedrich Arnold Brockhaus presided over extensive enterprises and great wealth. Publishers moved in the upper bourgeoisie and took part in city governance in leading cities, Leipzig, Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and elsewhere. Although the book trade depended on cooperation through mutual interest, they embraced the ethos of competition and market culture, which also impelled them to trust consumer demand. Yet they equally saw themselves as a cultural elite. the emissaries of light and truth, who promoted the arts and sciences as well as the self-governing ideas of civil society. They touted the printed word as the soul of the nation's cultural identity and as the engine of an enlightened reform. And there are many books by publishers full of this self-congratulatory prose. But this self-congratulation wasn't entirely wrong. If we see the Enlightenment as a process of communication, whose social sites, voluntary associations, and reading practices reconstituted social and political conduct, the commercial networks and cultural milieu of publishers figure significantly into this equation. Although historiography has made much of cafes, salons, and associational life as important incubators of civil society, bookstores are curiously overlooked. This study redresses this oversight, or at least it tries to. Because contraband literature necessitated a hand-to-hand exchange, bookshops loomed large for oppositional politics. Post offices forbade the circulation of banned books and periodicals, and government strictly limited what peddlers vended it in the street and door to door. Hence, oppositional ideas circulated to the extent that they did because hundreds of book dealers agreed to accept contraband literature through the direct exchange of other book dealers. Hidden in the great crates, the so-called Ballen of unbound print matter, books, journals, and brochures made their way throughout Germany, many of them with false title pages, false lading bills, and counterfeit imprints. Much of this exchange took place at the semi-annual book fairs in Leipzig through their book commissioners, which local book dealers also expanded in the black market through their own networks. And before I change the slide, you all know, or most of you know certainly, the Campus bookstore in Hamburg, which was very much a talking shop of politics and literature in the 1830s and the 1840s and thereafter. And it's not just a place to buy a book. And as you see by this sketch by Liza in the early 1830s, there's lots of conversation. It also features the book trade's most famous dog, Corolla, standing on its hind legs. On the right, we see the Verlagsbuchhandlung Ferdinand Hirt, which is in Breslau, and this was an important site for exchanging illegal information about Polish and Hungarian liberalism in the 1830s. And the Hirts were arrested. Their bookstore was searched, and this too, although this is from a brochure in the 1850s. This looks like a staid, Gutbürgerliche social site, but it has its subversive accents. And when we talk about not just at Leipzig did they exchange information, from my work in archives and through police files, we can locate local regional clusters of networks of book dealers that use their couriers to smuggle pamphlets store to store. To read banned text, one needed to enter a bookstore and make the appropriate discrete inquiries. In this fashion, Johann Jacobi's Four Questions, a landmark essay that reignited the constitutional movement in Prussia in 1841, moved 3,500 copies because a Leipzig publisher using a counterfeit Mannheim imprint worked with a local printer and intermediaries to smuggle the pamphlet to dozens of bookstores throughout Prussia and Germany. You'll see that the fake imprint is from Hoff in Mannheim, and he most assuredly readily agreed to be part of this scheme. Although the Prussian government took great pains to ban and confiscate the book, the publisher Georg Wiegand and Friedrich Nies, a Leipzig printer, used their well-established networks to sell over 2,000 copies in Prussia alone. Because of the success of publishers to circumvent government fiats depended on the complicity of shop assistants, warehouse workers, teamsters, and market runners, police spies characterized book dealers as a state within a state. As one of Metternich's agents complained in September 1833, when one considers that of the 937 foreign and domestic bookstores which Germany possesses, at least 2/3 of them are bound together to protect and defend themselves. They have erected a separate state in numerous German lands, spreading their mercantile influence and mutually defending themselves through all conceivable means that stand at their disposal. Hence, the secret receipt of forbidden books is all the more difficult to trace. This is really one of his problems. He can't find the books because thousands of complicitous persons are ready to lend a hand in the surreptitious trafficking through self-interest, distorted ideals, evil intent, malice joy, or mere curiosity. I love how he just falls off the mere curiosity of the. Consequently, the smuggling of books and its requisite preparations are carried out with unparalleled refinement. End quote. In short, bookstores were not just another site of commercial exchange, but rather the central transmission belt for oppositional political culture. Linked to the publisher's role as cultural mediator was translation. Scholarship has rightly emphasized the late Enlightenment as a watershed era for the transnational circulation of books and ideas. In the period from 1770 to 1815, publishers reportedly translated 6,600 books and 9,300 essays from French into German. But the first half of the 19th century was no less significant. As we see in this slide, if the last 3 decades of the 18th century mark high points of the late Enlightenment, the mid-century decades constitute even higher peaks. More crucial than mere numbers, these translations found new readers from lower social strata. The translation factories of the Frank brothers in Stuttgart, the Schumann firm in Zwickau, and Joseph Meyers in Hildburghausen typified a new brand of publisher who marketed Walter Scott, Eugène Sue, Honoré Balzac, Charles Dickens, and others as inexpensive serialized fiction. By breaking up long novels into serialized fascicles, publishers attracted ordinary readers. They competed with the lending libraries, whose exposure to alternative social contracts and political behavior recast what Hans Robert Jauss has called the horizon of expectations. But imaginative literature was not the only genre. For the first time, ordinary readers found inexpensive serial literature of the French Enlightenment, providing exposure to Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and others. Moreover, the forbidden legacy of the French Revolution was also translated as affordable tract material. Marat, Babeuf, Blanc, Proudhon, Blanqui, and others. Between 1791 and 1848, 13 translations of Thomas Paine appeared, complementing a broader reception of the American and French revolutions, the Spanish Constitution of Cadiz, Greek emancipation, and other revolutions in Italy and Latin America. This second wave of translation helps clarify the pan-European character of 1848. As Christopher Clark notes, Europeans, regardless of nationality, no longer viewed the many arenas of revolutionary activity as isolated contingent mishaps, but rather as an interconnected disorder. German language print markets confirm Clark's point. This second wave of translation punctured any remaining political insularity, and its inexpensive, accessible formats attracted new readers. This latter point about segmentation and remediation deserves greater emphasis. The diversification of print markets had political implications. The competitive drive to expand an illicit desire for print matter created in turn a common political ground among elite, middling, and popular social groups. Although levels of political deliberation differed radically from recondite philosophy to market leaflets, they addressed similar concerns. Grouping the vast spectrum of dissent into 3 rubrics of elite, middlebrow, and popular literature, this study shows how different readerships deliberated about constitutions, political representation, economic equity, and the legitimacy of monarchy. Although the flow of ideas is multidirectional, such middlebrow genres as lexica and pamphlets crucially remediated doctrines from elite treatises and journals. One salient example is Brockhaus's Konversationslexikon, which provided an alphabetized compendium of knowledge to consult compact discussions of liberalism, corporatism, democracy, republicanism, and more. And you'll see here just how small it is. This is small octave formats, small octave format. It's around 7.5 inches or so. And this too must be thought of in terms of reading practice. This is no longer the great folio of Diderot's encyclopedia. This is a book that can be brought places. This suggests a whole new range of reading practices. Alongside the enormous surge in encyclopedia production, one source cites 72 separate encyclopedia editions in the 1830s alone. We should also note the growth in political almanacs, political digests, political yearbooks, all of which compiled abbreviated commentary on current affairs. And here you have some examples of these politische Taschenbücher, these political pocketbooks, these political digests that reduced and abbreviated and crunched a year's worth of political commentary into sort of one accessible set of comments. And in that sense, this notion of Kurzfassung, of abbreviation, is a subject for discussion, a discussion to be studied further. For intellectual historians, such texts are of little importance, for they are derivative and unoriginal. But for social historians, their popularity is crucial. Through simplified, abbreviated language, publishers and authors marketed dissenting political alternatives to new readers. Alas, I don't have time tonight to address the many forms of dissent found in pamphlets, a printing universe unto itself that is also badly under-researched. But from catechisms to moral scolds, to chroniques scandaleuses, to political and religious polemics, the medium served numerous readerships from state ministers to farmers. Because Germany's throttled periodical press invited alternative forms of reportage and commentary, pamphlets play an outsized role in transferring oppositional viewpoints across media and readerships. When imagining the process of segmentation and popularization, the role of humor and subversive laughter looms important. Satire, parody, and political caricature sold well in popular formats. One prominent author of political humor was Adolf Glasbrenner, a Berlin wit who transformed sketches of local life into biting criticism. Censors shut down his journal, Berlin Don Quixote, within 2 years, but his Berlin, the Way It Is and Drinks, a series of 30 short pamphlets between 1834 and 1849, and a second series of 14 pamphlets, Bunte Berlin, or Colorful Berlin, between 1837 and 1850, struck a nerve, each of them enjoying multiple editions. His dialogues, anecdotes, and witty vignettes celebrated the egalitarian wisdom of the common man, whose impudent remarks set in bold relief a certain contempt toward the political order. Glasbrenner used 3 Leipzig publishers to evade Prussian censors, and his success found many imitators who used the motif of folkloric sketches to critique political conditions in Vienna, Hamburg, Munich, Swabia, and elsewhere. In short, the marketing of humorous brochures, and political almanacs, and lithographic caricatures, and penny leaflets extended the spectrum of dissent into popular culture. Politicized singing was the most difficult to control. Combining both oral and print culture, song sheets about constitutions, the French Revolution and Napoleon, aspirational freedom in Poland and Greece, the freedom of thought, and not least the expulsion of princes in Germany, all express oppositional sentiments in various forms. The Czech song, a ballad about the failed attempt of a disgruntled mayor to assassinate King Friedrich Wilhelm IV in 1844, dissolved any respect for royalty. By placing its sympathy with the assassin and not the victim, the song's sardonic irony moved older tropes of tyrannicide toward a more modern register of condoning political violence. Its lyrics and the field of popular culture that it inhabited tells us much about the critical disposition of popular publics. The achievement of print markets in creating the spectrum of dissent helps explain the breadth of participation in the revolution of 1848-49. But this study avoids a narrative of triumphant liberalism by also exposing its serious limitations. Whereas liberalism became a permissible form of dissent in the 1840s because liberals were tolerant of monarchy, the democratic print matter remained criminalized. During the 15 years before the 1848 revolution, less printers, not more, marketed democratic dissent. After 1840, only a dozen or so printers were willing to undertake the risks of investing in such print matter, and the task fell to printers in Switzerland and France to circulate such material. The problem lay not in demand, rather in the marginality of radical print, the marginality of radical print lay in the success of Prussian and Austrian censorship regimes, its information order. And I give you two maps made from police files when they uncovered lists of distribution lists for Swiss publishers and for Parisian publishers. And on the left are two important publishers from Fröbel and Schlepfer, who had in their packing crate the list of the bookshops that it was supposed to go to. And so you see a fairly impressive breadth of bookshops across northern Germany there. Southern Germany is also represented. It's just not being shipped through these smugglers. They're going across borders. This is coming up through France and then through Belgium. But so that's an impressive image. But I hasten to add here that with the breadth, there is shallow depth, that these bookstores are only ordering 2 or 3 or 4 copies. And by the dint of the fact that we know this meant that these books didn't get there. They didn't get there. I mean, and similarly, this is Ruge and Marx's Französische Jahrbücher from 1844. It's a print run of around 1,000. Half of it will be confiscated. Another few hundred will be confiscated on half is on the border. Another third is confiscated on a steamship on the Rhine. And in that sense, these bookstores who ordered it, so there's 11 bookstores in Frankfurt, 4 books in Darmstadt. These are in some ways impressive numbers, but again, this is they never got there. And I also want to point out the fact that these are only available to the cognoscenti, the people who know. You have to ask your book dealer to go under the counter and get the book for you to buy the book. This is not in the book window. This is not in the window. It's not on the corner display. So this is part of my frustration with intellectual historians and political historians is that, yes, Ruge published extensively, but who actually got his books in his hand to read it? What is the reception of the left Hegelians in the 1830s and 1840s? And they're bored with this question, but I am not. Although recent scholarship on censorship accents the failures of the state to regulate ideas, my study offers a broader perspective. As Bärbel Holz and Norbert Bachleitner and others have rightly emphasized, the machinery of Prussian and Austrian censorship buckled under the pressure of expanding book markets in the 1840s, forcing both governments to curtail regulation before the Revolution of 1848. Yet despite these concessions, and despite the many examples of banned texts finding their way to the hands of readers, censorship regimes nonetheless succeeded in marginalizing democratic print matter. Texts on republicanism remained marginal, consigned to the status of contraband sold under the counter. Limited to a shrinking network of book dealers willing to circulate such print wares, democratic dissent persisted to reside on the fringe of print markets. The interpretive community of democratic protest remained exclusive. Moreover, because democratic ideas found little or no outlet in middlebrow periodicals, frustration set in. Radicals certainly worked as journalists in Germany, but they wrote as moderate liberals and not in their own voice. And this too is a subject that demands more attention. The essays of Karl Heinzen, Jakob Venedig, Hermann Putman, and others evolved toward a polemical register that is a strident militancy that lacked the nuance to promote critical, rational deliberation, to use the famous phrase of our dearly departed Habermas. Heinzen called his pamphlets grenades, an odd metaphor for a text striving to persuade skeptical minds. Despite the public's demand for a more substantive debate about radicalism, print markets failed to provide it. In 1847, the Confederation even shuttered the famous Literarisches Comptoir in Winterthur, Switzerland, because Julius Froebel, the publisher, could no longer sustain the cost of shipping and the confiscations that came with long-distance smuggling routes. Froebel, just for those who don't know, this was like the A-list of oppositional verse, oppositional literature, and political commentary. Michael Schlepfer, another important Swiss publisher of democratic texts, suffered equally. Between 1846 and 1850, he bore the cost of 28 confiscations, amounting a cumulative loss of 4,500 thalers, a sum that few printers could bear. In short, the structural constraints of German language print markets shaped a select readership, preventing the principles of popular sovereignty and political equality from effectively challenging moderate liberalism's stance as a dominant oppositional movement. Now, it is a commonplace that the 1840 revolution introduced freedom of the press, but this claim is largely wrong. Despite the fanfare of ending censorship, governments banned democratic print through other laws still in effect, such as those addressing libel, lèse-majesté, and incitement to riot. Because the revolution balked at limiting monarchy's privileges, calls for a republic remained illegal, thus putting Democrats at risk in town and countryside. Hundreds who spoke or wrote in the name of republicanism were arrested, and the list is long. In Berlin and elsewhere, authorized banned street sales of pamphlets, such as these that you see here, as well as wall posters, a chief medium of communication for Democrats, as well as banning open-air assemblies. Following the occupation of Berlin in November of 1848, the closing of clubs and closure of democratic papers became the norm. Democratic voices did not enjoy freedom of the press. More crucially, the ban on democratic print continued for decades after 1848. And for this reason, the late absolutist information order continued into the unification era and beyond. Although Prussia guaranteed freedom of expression in its decreed constitution of December 1848, a final clause permitted the state to restrict press and book trade with other legislation. Unbelievable. There it is. Pre-publication censorship was now replaced with post-publication legal review, providing police with ample power to repress oppositional viewpoints. And post-publication legal review meant a lot of money. It meant that you would print a whole run of 1,000 or 2,000 copies of a book to have it impounded and pulped. That's a huge investment. In fact, police surveillance tightened. In June 1849, for example, Prussia extended legal responsibility for press infractions to publisher, printer, author, editor, book commissioners, and other agents of distribution, which shifted the burden of oversight to all commercial sectors. This is a character, a comic from 1849, mocking this law. The threat of culpability exposed booksellers to ruinous confiscations and litigation. These fears engendered a political timidity, what today we call anticipatory obedience, that dramatically reduced the supply chain of clandestine literature. What once made an oppositional political culture in the first half of the century now withered. After June 1850, a Prussian ordinance stipulated that 3 press infractions permitted the state to cashier a paper's cautionary deposit and suppress the newspaper. Bismarck revived this law in the 1860s. Subsequent laws in 1850 and 1852 raised the cost of security bonds and introduced a prohibitively expensive stamp tax, which raised the price of newspapers and lowered circulation. A newly created police association in 1854 intensified state coordination across borders to track down and arrest publishers of illegal pamphlets, which sent a shockwave through the book trade. Technically, the 1850s and 1860s were censor-free, but in reality, they remained more suppressed than before. In view of these laws and other forms of government surveillance, Otto Wiegand, our friend, declared in a newspaper editorial of 1850 that the censorship of the 1840s was preferable to the information order of the post-revolutionary era. Shocked me when I read that. Other titans of dissent, Jules Campe, Heinrich Brockhaus, Christoph Leska, expressed similar views about the narrowed parameters of post-revolutionary markets. Hence, while the book trade boomed, and it boomed in the era of unification and thereafter, it would be wrong to correlate market growth with an expanding public sphere of open inquiry. That is, a public sphere tolerant of lawful, constitutional political dissent. The continuities of Prussia and Austria's information order across 1848 are then significant, yet, to my mind, remain underappreciated in my field of political history. Historians cordon off the reactionary 1850s as a short-lived era, thereby heralding the revival of middle-class politics in 1858, the so-called New Era, and the onset of political opposition in 1862 as a robust return to liberal democratic principles. But print markets qualify this argument. The rightward shift of liberalism after 1850 reoriented oppositional politics exclusively toward monarchical liberalism. Democratic political dissent underwent irreparable harm in the 1850s. Its clubs and associations were in disarray. The exodus of authors, editors, and printers left a gaping hole in political culture. And not least, German governments annulled or erased the legitimacy of democratic practice in 1848-49. State trials and their publications constructed an official memory that viewed radicalism as a doctrine of criminality and treason, thereby expunging from it the nation-building narratives of this very important era of history-making. With this legal basis, Bismarck throttled the oppositional press with renewed vigor, and it is noteworthy that Germany's much-vaunted press law of 1874 failed to protect the viewpoints of law-abiding Republicans, Catholics, and Social Democrats, to name just a few social groups who suffered under this press law. My conclusion then strikes a balance between achievement and limitation when addressing the institution of dissent in German political culture. This study has emphasized the book trade's assertive agency to carve out spheres of civil society to make, sell, and exchange print wares. Its network of independent publishers and semi-annual book fairs produce a formidable economy of knowledge, communication, and critical inquiry, a legacy that very much stems from the 18th century. The book trade served core readerships, but also looked to other readers to expand markets, offering a variety of formats at a range of prices to induct non-elite social groups into the political nation. Yet we must distinguish between liberal and democratic dissent, and in doing so, underscore the resiliency of the Austro-Prussian information order, which in modified but strengthened form throttled democratic practice in the post-revolutionary era. A newer historiography has positively interpreted the new realism of liberals who brokered alliances with conservatives in the 1860s, but note well that this revolution in government, and there are positive aspects to report on it, came at the expense of democratic dissent. Liberal participation in nation building between 1858 and 1878 excluded democratic aspirations. The Progressive Party, the German Empire's ostensible left-wing voice that opposed Bismarck, fully confirms the diminished, if not vitiated, sensibility about political equality. Its inaugural program of 1861, for example, doesn't even mention or demand universal manhood suffrage. More crucially, the civic culture of the bourgeoisie, its educational curricula, its forms of sociability, and its reading matter shifted away from the emancipatory vistas of previous decades. Democratic discourse did not die in Germany, but it migrated from bourgeois civic culture to the milieu of social democrats and their laboring constituents. For this reason, the mid-century period from 1840 to 1860 looms as a pivotal epoch in the relationship of the German bourgeoisie to democracy. Not until after 1918 would a German parliament embrace democratic citizenship as envisioned in the 1830s and the 1840s. And the Grundgesetz of 1948 is really, all of its language is lifted from 1848. Be that as it may, the role of publishers in marketing emancipatory ideas under adverse conditions tell us much about the struggle of promoting open inquiry and democratic rights over the long 19th century. And because these problems of political communication have in no way disappeared, and because current abuses of state power continue to use similar tactics to suppress dissent, their setbacks and achievements continue to beckon our attention. Thank you very much.
Floor is open for questions, comments. Liliana.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talks. Wonder about the term democratic that you take as a given throughout your presentation. And I wonder whether one cannot turn it around and say that in that time of strife, negotiations, and whatever, something like the democratic idea was tested and redefined throughout the 19th century. Because certainly there were nationalists who called themselves democratic, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very malleable word, multivalent, polysemous. And you're right. And what's particularly difficult for the 1830s and 1840s is there were Democrats who saw their radicalism growing out of liberalism, but sometimes it was indistinguishable, and observers would sort of hyphenate it and call it liberal democratic. And so really right up into the 1840s, there's sort of conceptual muddiness as to what distinguishes the two. That said, I mean, there are clearly authors and who identify themselves as radical Democrats, and they are not liberals, and that starts in the 1830s. We see from speeches at Hambach, at the Hambach Festival, but also so much of the illicit literature. So that's one problem, is this whole issue about categories and self-identity. But I think your question about this idea of openness and participation and a level playing field in the marketplace of ideas. I
wouldn't say level playing field, but okay. I would like to suggest it's a time when the political categories get formed.
Yeah.
And one perhaps not assume them to be firm in the very beginning, and certainly what I view as democratic may not be what. Yeah.
Right. The word was studiously avoided in the 1850s and 1860s. I mean, to the point where August Bebel didn't ask for a democratic republic; he asked for a free people state, ein freier Volksstaat. He uses it as a euphemism to avoid the D word. So I think that it gets detoxified into the 1870s and 1880s, but this is sort of an interesting element, and people are talking about sort of a democratic society within a monarchical state, and that's something for discussion. And it's interesting, the sort of late imperial Wilhelmine Germans have lots to criticize about Adel, the aristocracy, but less so about monarchy, showing a contempt for one, but sort of an affection for the other. My question being is, you get both, I mean, but that perception is interesting, that they're wary of corporatism, but they're not necessarily critical in these bourgeois milieu. But that is something that is up for discussion, that during the Kaiserreich, how this word democracy gets used. I mean, it's interesting to know too how it transforms in lexica over the 19th century. And it's just interesting to note that liberals are very wary of democracy. They're looking to ancient models. They see tyranny in it. They don't have good things to say about democracy. So in Brockhaus's lexicon from 1830 and 1840, you still have this wariness. And this annoys radical Democrats who want entryway into these middle-brow periodicals and aren't getting it. And it's liberals who are framing the terms of the debate, as it were. So like the most open-ended definitions or positive expressions of democracy come in the 1840s or so. The second edition of Stadt's lexicon. But there, after 1850, again, it goes back, and this is all a problem, and modern democracies lead to mob rule and tyranny and nothing more. And in that sense, that's and that would be interesting to follow up into the Kaiserreich, into the Wilhelmine, which I haven't. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk and great work. I have to read the book. Yes, I mean, after 1871, under Bismarck, we had this kind of fake democracy in Prussia, very free electoral rights. But then, as the result was not in the sense of he just dissolved the parliament and then new elections and so on. And the same goes also for all these popular formats, printing formats, which you presented already after 1848. Like the state used these formats.
Yes, they did.
For like,
yes, they did.
Pretending to give democracy to the people or to give education to the people, but this was all propaganda, of course.
Yeah,
but
you're absolutely right.
Interesting. They capered all these, pirated all these popular formats. Then after 1848,
they're very clever. They took these provincial gazettes and almanacs and turned it into a sort of a mouthpiece for the government in a sort of a folksy, accessible way. So they too were, turning they were propagating in a middle brow voice and a popular voice for their own purposes. We also want to keep in mind, when again talks about the Reich press laws, there's a lot of semi-official papers. I mean, there's lots of journalists on the pay. And there isn't genuine democratic papers in Prussia. So Franz Dunker, Volkszeitung, he has to put up with like 3 spies who are setting type for him. And it's just he's constantly being brought into the police office. He's being arrested, and it's very, very. You're just harried out of town. It's just hard to put up with. So when I hear these sonorous terms about democracy in the Kaiserreich, I sort of thought, well, let's talk Turkey. What are we talking about here? So yes, there is an openness, and there is a certain degrees of political pluralism. There's a political landscape that boasts different, but it just doesn't include Democrats. And let's remember that Vorwärts is smuggled for decades across the border from Switzerland. That there's no real even playing field here for social democrats either. And think of the hundreds of editors locked up during the Kulturkampf. This is this sort of Prussian campaign against Catholic newspapers, Catholic churches, Catholic schools. What do we say to that? So I think it's important to talk about these modern electoral that we're having open elections in this authoritarian state, but I also want to temper the enthusiasm that this is a completely democratic public sphere.
Yes, because also in the UK, recent UK history research, there are some attempts to rehabilitate the reactionary period in Manteuffel after 48, and I like your analysis.
So in some ways, I mean, I was a part of that initial crew. My first book about railroads, I was looking at how businessmen and entrepreneurs accommodated their needs to the Prussian authoritarian state, and how you industrialize under such a state. And there's a very, very innovative element to the 1850s sort of interventionist government, the reworking of cities. I mean, the Manteuffel's government is an interesting regime. It's just not interested in Democrats. So, if we were, again, if we're going to talk about this new era, let's just be. I think we have to be just more rigorous in setting up our praise for them.
As someone outside the field, I wonder if you can clarify some of the topography of what you're speaking about. So you started with the extraordinary maps and figures of the decentralization of German publishing. Your narrative shifts to the Prussian Constitution of 1848 and the restrictions of the Prussian Constitution. Do those restrictions, those constitutional restrictions, extend to the many other German states before unification, or are there states that are relatively more liberal? What is the mechanism for censorship outside of Prussia? My other question is, as a person whose background is in literary studies, if I think of German publishing in the 19th century, I'm thinking of literary publishing. And I'm wondering whether the publishers you're looking at are also literary publishers, or whether there is a different regime of publication. Also, if the literary publishers are facing the same questions of censorship, because of course culture is framed not only by overtly political discourse, but
this is the era
what is
political verse.
What is the Romantic movement?
I mean, this is when a poem and a song was far more powerful than a
so those two questions. The regime of censorship outside of Prussia after 1848, and the structures of literary publishing superimposed on the publishers you're working on, or is it a different publishing?
No, these are two these are great questions. Let me do the first question. So prior to 1850, we have 39 states in the German Confederation, and there are states who are have mild censorship regimes. They were sometimes called oases or bolt holes. And in that sense, it was fairly easy to, let's take the example of Jules Kampe, who published Heine, Börne, but also political tracts. He was just a publisher, not a printer. But he would choose a state, such a Thuringian state, a small state, or he would choose Braunschweig. He had relatives there, but it was also a very liberal, and would have the book printed there. It would undergo censorship in that state. And so you would get the imprint, the imprimatur, and then you had the license to sell. Now, Prussia can do nothing against that, except now slap a ban against this book that has been released onto the market. So it's banned from Prussian markets, but it's not banned in the German language print ecology. And that's why there are so many illegal books circulating in Central Europe, because you can go to a Württemberg, which was a very liberal censorship regime, or a Thuringia, or wherever, and publish these books, and then find a way to get them into the Habsburg territories. And this was doable. I mean, Kampe openly bribed the Habsburg officials. He said, yeah, it's 25% more for the book, but it's calculable. We can do it. As long as the Habsburg officials are corrupt, we will get Börne to the Habsburg territory.
So I mean, you presented a narrative, which I think very compelling one, of the bookstore as the place where these contraband material needs to be handed over. What about individual travelers? I live in Berlin. I'm politically savvy. I am liberal. Am I able to travel to Thuringia and get a suitcase full of books and bring them back into Prussia as a private citizen, or is that also an illegal action?
No, probably.
So
I mean, the police apparatus complains bitterly that they just can't, especially with the railroads coming into play. They just can't really control it all. Whether you can bring whole trunk loads, I don't know, but certainly people were doing that.
Yeah.
To some extent.
So that's a different underground.
That's a different underground. I mean, that again, it's still a part of the cognoscenting.
Yeah.
And so I mean, my argument, and it'd be wonderful to discuss here. When you deprive a certain kind of literature a mainstream audience, what does that do to that, to the authors, to the reading practices, and because it never enjoyed a mainstream hearing of its ideals and principles, this was something that even liberals did not want to abide. I mean, keep in mind, in Baden, the most liberal of the states in the 1848 revolution, they arrest two of my book dealers, Fickler in Konstanz and Hoff in Mannheim, because they're producing democratic newspapers, but not liberal newspapers. And they didn't want, Baden, as you may or may not know, is a hotbed of democratic activity. I mean, there is a grassroots democratic activity far from intellectuals or far from publishers, and they did not want these democratic papers getting into their hands. So they threw Hoff into prison for 6 months. Yeah, this is I'm sorry, you had a question?
Second question.
The question was about literary.
Oh, yes. No, this is a very important part. So many of my book dealers also publish literature and poetry. And the whole trick to publishing was to have diversity and to find steady sellers, maybe get a gig with your king or prince to have a privileged guaranteed monopoly on a calendar to make money. But you would also speculating in novels was a way of making money. And in that sense, there was a lot of interest in marketing literature and verse along with political commentary. I should add that the percentage of politicum in print markets is small. This is not the great drivers of the economic boom. So when we talk about stereotype novels and we talk about the steam press rolling off, the democratization of print does not help democratic print. That democratic print is still an illegal contraband material being produced in the night on hand letterpress presses in issues of 500 and 1,000, and not rolling off 10,000 copies, the way Balzac novels are or the like. So we have this great disparity here. But I mean, I think your question is that they are very much combined.
Liliana?
If I may just add, I'm sorry, politics also.
Speak up, please.
Politics also transcended to the novel. For example, Gutzko, Walle die Zweiflerin, the novel was prime censored because it was arguably threatening the morals of the state.
And this is so important because young Germany was seen as corrupting this youth. And to corrupt the morals means that you are challenging religiosity, which means you're challenging the bedrock of the social order of absolutism. And so it's not really just about censorship of political ideas, and it's not just about censorship. This is why I use the term information order. It's the whole sort of cultural formation of producing a bodies of knowledge that will support throne and altar and the established social order. And so that's why the novels of young Germany were considered outrageous, because you were challenging religious doctrine, you were challenging normative sexual practices, and this was an outrage. So politics very much bleeds into church issues, religious issues, cultural issues. I mean, cultural politics have been around for a long time.
Yeah, and still with us. John.
Davida.
Davida and then John.
So I am fascinated by what you were talking about with the police records that give you data of who was suppressed and how. So I'm kind of interested in the mechanism of suppression, which Jerry was also getting at, where there's this paradox of publishing a list of authors who are or their works who are to be banned in and of itself is making that list, that list of those people publish. It's publicizing the dangerousness and therefore
The best advertisement ever.
yeah, exactly. So what they're doing is in some ways preserving exactly what they are also trying to wipe out. So I'm wondering what kinds of records you found that they were keeping. Did they keep copies of the pamphlets that they were banning? I mean,
Sometimes they're sewn into the files, the Akta. You'll get the actual sections, whole pamphlets, and sometimes sections of the novels that are considered considered illegal or so yes. I mean, the police files of subversive activity is quite extensive. And so in Berlin and Dahlem, there's just meters and meters and meters of censorship files.
when you're dealing with ephemera, which is going to disappear very easily out in the world, I mean,
Right.
the police might be the
So-
best way of preserving it.
Yeah, and Prussia's censorship laws after 1815, after 1820, everything comes under review. Restaurant menus came under review. Theater playbills came under review.
It's not bad. Not bad.
Vienna, Austria was the same way. The German Confederation was lighter, and anything in the German Confederation, anything above essentially 320 octavo pages was considered censor-free. Which is an interesting observation because this suggests that they're not interested in censoring the academic middle classes or the learned readers. They were worried about popular readers.
Yeah.
So what would Compa do to market Heine? He would sort of make very large margins and compile certain poems in order to get a more famous verse in, to get it over 320, and then you could publish it. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't want to censor you.
Yeah, John had some comments.
Go ahead.
I mean,
Just one,
Yeah.
may I add?
Yeah.
I just want to add in the case of Heine, he complained once that he wasn't enough censored because it made him famous.
Yeah.
And Kampe was using the transport system in shipping the books quickly. But to what you said, I think we cannot think of the censorship as done by the police. They had people hired to censor. A lot of them were not for that. They were lawyers or authors, literary authors.
This is not a 20th century.
Hoffman or whatever. They were all.
This is not a 20th century dystopia.
Right.
Theologians looked at theology.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting when you get into Polish works published in Prussia, because there's a large that you had to bring it to a Pole who sort of sympathized with the movement, but had to censor it. But I mean, this is an important point that very well-read highbrow readers were censors. So Ernst John is the reader of Young Germany. He's reading the Gutzkopf, he's reading Heine. This is the former secretary of Goethe. It's a person who knows how to read literature.
And a lot of them were complaining that they don't get paid for the censoring, or complaining that they don't know anymore how to censor, and writing long letters to the police that, for example, Bernard drove one guy crazy. He had to
Censorship isn't what it was. No one knows how to do this.
So
But
it's not.
It's a very variegated practice, and it's hard to make generalizations for.
And what you just said there actually sounds a lot like the old regime. I mean, that understanding of
It is the old
censorship is right out of the 18th century. Although
Yeah.
a lot of what you've just described,
And
Is-
what drove Marx crazy is
yeah.
there's no criteria. It's up to the personal subjectivity of the censor.
although it also sounds like a state that's trying to make the criteria. Thank you, Davida, for raising that. I don't know, we're maybe gonna run out of
Yeah,
time, but I wanted to raise a slightly different thing, because Roger and I just spent our afternoon talking with our students about press censorship and the French Revolution. So, and how the lid blew off in the 1790s. So that's the bias of my question. But it was interesting early on in your talk, you had you mentioned how a lot of the texts that are circulating are not the new young Turks of democracy, but old voices. And I don't know if it's possible to characterize the kinds of illicit material, but it was interesting to hear how much of it was the 18th century, and particularly the French 18th century, that is still the threatening literature of the mid 19th century. And I wonder if
our publishers are publishing the 1793 Constitution and getting arrested for it.
Wow.
So that's, which is in our exhibit over there, as you can see, that was Marx's great, so, I mean, I'm interested if there is textual evidence about, or, you have your censors or your government sort of telling us what the bad books are of the past, and also how that works, sort of almost feeds a kind of nostalgia for a certain revolutionariness of that revolution.
It's a great question. And I think it's also just in terms of the reception of the Enlightenment, we have some experts here, is to think about this second wave of reception. And in the same way that William St. Clair argued for Victorian England, that during the Romantic Age, it's popular readers really only started to read the Augustan age. Likewise, in Vormärz Germany, in Restoration Germany, that a certain kind of reader really first read Voltaire and Rousseau because of literacy, because of accessibility, because of price, etc.
But was it well, that was my question. Was it being censored in the same way? You talk about all these translations. Was it coming through? Because I thought,
Translation were excluded a long time from censorship.
That's what I think is interesting.
Translations are often, and as we were just talking, how variegated this censorship is. One-time publications like pamphlets or calendars are censored very loosely, as opposed to the periodical press and the like. But I mean, something that is outrightly seditious, of course, is.
So if you're trying to capture the things that are popular, you would think you're going after those kinds of things.
It's different. I mean, Thomas Paine is always illegal. It's kind of interesting. I mean, you can buy out of Vienna, you can buy a 28 fascicle format of Montesquieu and Rousseau, but Thomas Paine, and it's because of his deism. It's this, and which is also interesting because rationalized Protestant theology. I mean, this is also, I mean, the rationalized Enlightened theology of Lutheranism and in Göttingen and elsewhere. And yet, even in 1848, Philip Reclam is still a major publisher, brings out The Age of Reason. It's in the middle of the revolution. He gets arrested. He's put in prison. And he doesn't get off in 1848-49. He is arrested for selling The Age of Reason. So some philosophers or some enlightened folk don't get off.
Okay, that's what.
But Voltaire, yes, Voltaire is the leader in the formats in terms of the philosophers. But
you're talking about all of these guys who are renowned, Condorcet, all of them. It's just really interesting to think how many of them were being translated. And
what's more suspicious or more alarming for the authorities is Lamennais, more so than the French, the Enlightened philosophers. And so this idea of having a social Christianity, a constitutional Christianity, that he also is advocating republicanism. Bürda translated him. He's one of the 8 translators of Lamennais in the 1830s. That's interesting to know. So not all translations are just get it by.
That's interesting. Where the censorship is happening and where not. I mean, are people. I mean, is there some method for people knowing what things are censored, or is there
algorithms?
What?
It's very interesting to read the correspondence between publishers and authors, and the publisher has a very good idea of what he can do.
Yeah.
And you know, someone like a Compa was brilliant at it. He would bring the first 7 chapters, get the print, and then the more subversive chapters, you know, then are larded in and it's printed, and then all, you know, the
bigger
nonsense breaks
books are
loose.
okay.
But they know which centers to bring to where, to what, who is sympathetic. But I mean, the political periodicals in Leipzig is the book center in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
And the professors at the university are the censors for the periodical press and political philosophy. So these are interesting liberals. So Bülow, the censor for the political philosophy, who's censoring the Leftigalians and the like, he has over 40 entries in Welker's and Rotek's Staatslexikon. So that is the sort of the primer, the liberal primer of the formats. This sort of who's who of liberals and writing for this encyclopedia. So he's contributing to this, to the normative project of the West, liberalism, constitutionalism, a man who sees himself as a progressive figure on the right side of history, but yet censoring, and he's a kind censor. He's trying to help them to publication. He says, you guys are so precious. Just take out this sentence, move this over here, kill the little darling, and we'll publish the book. You know, I mean, these kinds of negotiations as to what, how to bring a book to press and what to do. But some people were just hated it. I mean, Heine hated it. You know, how dare you touch one of my words? Yeah, so it all depends, you know, on your attitude.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask one last question with a short answer, out of curiosity. You know, I thought the quote from Vicant that you started with was so wonderful and so puzzling. But what is the German original for the reading rabble?
Lesepöbel. So pöbel is a word for like the canaille or the
mob. Yeah.
mob.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a remarkably.
So he uses a very kind and affectionate way. If you look at his letters, he talks about in sort of a very warning, like Papa Vegans bringing the fruits to the Lesepöbel, but others don't.
When he's talking about society's outermost strata, and maybe you said that, when he's talking about society's outermost strata, are those the reading rabble or the outermost strata, the reading rabble and the intellectual aristocracy? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, either side. Well,
thank you. It's a terrific quote.
it is a wonderful quote, and we thank you for this wonderful presentation.